If you ever wished to witness a medieval battle, you wouldn't last a minute. The air stank of fear. Bones shattered under boots, and when the lines met, it wasn't a dance of steel. It was a meat grinder where no one came out clean. This is what really happened in a medieval battle. But before that grinder turned, before a single sword was drawn, or a war cry rang across the hills, there was silence. The kind of silence that only men waiting to kill or die can create. Not the peaceful stillness of a forest or the sleepy hush of morning, but a charged, aching, unnatural pause, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Across a field soon to be soaked in blood, two armies stared at each other from opposite ends, each pretending not to tremble, each pretending they were ready. It began hours earlier, not with fighting but with routine. Foot soldiers checked the leather straps on their gear with shaking fingers, tightening belts that already cut into their flesh, adjusting helmets that felt too heavy for their necks. The ground beneath them was still wet from night mist, and every step sank into mud, pulling at their feet like something alive. Archers unstrung and restrung their bows, fingers red from tension, while squires scurried between lines delivering last words from lords who stayed at the back. Some men whispered prayers, fumbling with rosaries or small wooden crosses carved by their own fathers. Others joked, not because they felt brave, but because silence would have cracked their minds. A few vomited quietly and walked back into line, hoping no one saw. The formation depended on where and when the battle took place, but the pattern repeated across centuries. In the front stood infantry, usually peasants with spears, billhooks, clubs. Sometimes nothing more than farm tools. Behind them, men-at-arms clad in chain or plate, depending on wealth, better trained but just as mortal. Archers were placed on the flanks or at the rear, hunched in loose ranks, waiting for the first signal. And somewhere farther back, out of arrow range, the knights, wealthy, proud, wrapped in steel, mounted, and waiting for their charge. They were the image history remembers, but they were the last to join. The dying started long before they moved. Tacticians, if there were any, might discuss weather, elevation, how wind direction affected arrow flight. But on the ground, no one thought of strategy. Most didn't know what land they stood on, what date it was, or even the name of the enemy in front of them. They knew only that someone higher up had reasons, old grudges, royal succession, unpaid debts, or broken oaths, and that now they were here, not because they wanted to fight, but because they had no choice. The field itself, usually wide, open, flat, looked nothing like what movies show. There were no banners fluttering like theater curtains, no clean lines of gleaming armor. There were men, tired, hungry, many unwashed for days, standing in old boots with frayed laces, armor that pinched and bruised, shirts stiff with dried sweat. Horses defecated in place, flies gathered near wounds that hadn't healed from the last skirmish. The air was thick with smoke from campfires, dung, and something else, something sour, metallic, and close to panic. Then came the moments no one ever described in poems. The waiting, the unspoken countdown. Eyes glanced upward, not toward heaven, but toward the sun, to measure how much light remained. Because once it started, the battle wouldn't end until one side broke, and if it dragged too long, darkness would hide the final killings. People often say the battle began when someone shouted. That's not true. It began before the shout, in the way hands gripped weapons too tightly, in the way a man adjusted his stance, or reached for a charm, or pissed himself and didn't care. The order, when it came, didn't sound noble. It wasn't a trumpet call or a roar of courage. Often, it was simple. Go, or just a nod, and then motion, and then noise. But that part comes next, because the worst moment in a medieval battle wasn't the killing. It was knowing it was about to begin, and knowing that once you stepped forward, the world behind you vanished. What lay ahead wasn't glory. It was fire, bone, mud, and death. The first sound was not steel, nor the stamping of hooves. but the strange, rising whisper of air being torn apart, a sound so unnatural and sharp that many men didn't even realize what it was until the first wave of arrows struck flesh. The sky, only moments earlier a soft dome of clouds and nervous birds, now opened like a great black jaw, spitting its iron teeth down upon the trembling ranks below. Not in neat rows or choreographed arcs, but in chaotic, lethal bursts that fell wherever the wind carried them, sometimes far from the target, often too close. There was no shield large enough, no armor thick enough, no breath deep enough to protect against that first cruel gift of war. A storm of barbed iron launched not at heroes, but at anything that moved. Archers, often hidden behind hillocks or loose woods, released their volleys not with precision but with rhythm, their fingers blistered from the string, their breath hot with focus, their minds stripped of conscience. They didn't aim for eyes or throats. They aimed for air, because the mass of soldiers below was dense enough that simply filling the sky would guarantee blood. And blood came quickly, spraying from cheeks split by shattered shafts, from bellies opened by a lucky strike, from thighs pierced through mail as if it were cloth. One man screamed before falling. Another died without a sound, eyes wide, mouth open, hands twitching above a shaft buried in his chest. Horses reared and screamed, some struck before they had time to charge, collapsing sideways onto their riders and flattening anyone unlucky enough to be too close. The air thickened with dust, panic, and a metallic scent that clung to the tongue. Not quite blood, not quite sweat, but something sour and final. Even those who survived the first volley were not truly spared. Arrows struck shields with such force they splintered into jagged shrapnel. Others bounced off armor only to find softer targets behind it. A man might raise his buckler in time, only to feel the shaft drive into his foot. Another might crouch and find himself pierced from above by a shot that fell nearly vertical. And worst of all was not knowing when the next wave would come, not knowing whether to raise the shield or run, not knowing whether the body at your side was alive or simply hadn't fallen yet. Archers worked in groups, usually behind the main lines or on higher ground, pouring volleys in time with shouted commands. But there was little romance to it. These weren't elegant bowmen in green cloaks. They were exhausted men standing in mud, their arms aching, their fingers raw, drawing and loosing until the pile of arrows beside them vanished, or their commanders called for silence. They never saw the faces of those they killed, only distant flinches, collapses, and screams. But they heard the sounds, and those sounds were enough to follow them long after the field grew quiet. The ranks below, the infantry, the heart of any army, began to shift. Not forward, but inward. Shields raised higher. Spears trembled in fists now slick with sweat. Men crouched tighter, huddled closer, as though they could disappear into each other's presence. Yet in doing so, they became easier targets. Arrows found gaps between helmets. They struck men crouched low, crawling to retrieve fallen weapons or friends. Every instinct screamed to flee, but there was nowhere to flee that wasn't covered by that falling sky. And still the arrows came. A second wave, a third, sometimes more. With every volley, the field became more dangerous, not just because of the shafts, but because of the dead and dying now underfoot. Feet slipped on entrails. Ankles snapped in unseen holes. Panic rose not just in the heart, but in the limbs, in the loss of balance, in the certainty that to fall was to vanish beneath the next step, the next sword, the next hoof. Some tried to cover fallen comrades. Others fled from their own lines, only to be struck from behind by their lord's men, who had orders to punish cowards. And behind all of it, the commanders watched, not from cruelty, but from necessity, waiting for the right moment to unleash the next phase, the charge. But that was still to come. When the arrows stop falling and the world no longer shrieks from above, it does not mean safety or relief. It means something worse is coming, something closer, louder, and heavier. Because this is the moment when the lines begin to move, not with bravery or grace, but with the weight of men pushed forward by fear and pressure from behind, their feet dragging through mud and blood, their arms stiff from holding weapons they no longer feel confident in swinging. The front ranks do not step like champions. They are crushed into motion by the wave of bodies behind them, their lungs tight with dread, their eyes fixed on a mass of figures approaching from across the field, armored shapes, some limping, some charging, all closing the distance with a momentum that cannot be stopped once set in motion. When the two sides finally meet, there is no clear sound that marks the collision, no single shout, no mighty crash, but instead a sickening, uneven wave of impacts, wood slamming against metal, bone cracking under boots, and the sharp intake of breath as a soldier realizes his shield did not hold or his arm failed to rise fast enough. Formations that held firm in training crumble in seconds because no plan survives the moment of contact, and when the weapons begin to land, they do not cut in elegant arcs or clash with theatrical sparks. They smash, they pierce, they lodge deep into joints and jaws, making every inch of ground a site of panic and agony. In the crush of bodies, a man barely has space to raise his weapon, let alone aim it. And so the fighting becomes frantic, instinctive, messy. Shields bash into faces. Blades stab blindly toward shapes that may be enemy or friend. And men who fall are not helped but stepped on, either because their comrades do not notice or because stopping for even a second could mean being trampled down beside them. Some swing wildly, hoping to clear a space wide enough to breathe, while others can do nothing at all, their arms pinned, their view blocked, their fate dependent on what the man next to them does in the next breath. Weapons behave differently here than in stories. Swords rarely slice cleanly, and even a well-placed blow might be absorbed by armor, deflected by a raised arm, or caught in bone and rendered useless. Axes bury themselves too deep to pull out quickly. Maces hit with terrifying force but require space to swing that rarely exists in the tangled mass of bodies. Spears are good until they break or until their length becomes a liability in close quarters, and then they are abandoned, replaced by knives or fists or whatever can be gripped. Some men lose their weapons and do not live long enough to find another. Others forget they are even holding one, stunned by the screaming, the pressure, the smell of torn flesh too close to their face. Cries of pain and fear rise over the battlefield, not as distinct voices, but as a collective roar, rising and falling with every wave of movement. The sound of thousands of throats pouring out everything inside them at once. Rage, despair, orders that no one hears, and prayers that no one answers. Blood runs across the ground, turning dirt into sludge, soaking into torn boots, making footing treacherous and retreat almost impossible. No one looks behind them anymore, because behind is just as full of danger as ahead, and the only direction left is deeper into the center of the chaos, into the heart of noise and heat and fear. Horses, if they are present, only add to the confusion. Charging through the flanks, knocking men aside like branches, their hooves breaking bones with every stomp, their eyes wide with panic, their riders swinging weapons that rarely land where intended. Sometimes a horse falls, bringing down its rider and anyone nearby. Sometimes it tramples friendly troops in the confusion, because animals know even less of loyalty than men do under such conditions. There is no space for tactics, no time for orders. The commanders are somewhere behind, shouting commands that fade into the wind, hoping the formation holds even as it dissolves beneath the weight of motion and fear. By the time the front ranks begin to give way, not because of cowardice, but because exhaustion and pressure have taken their toll, no one is truly fighting anymore in the way they imagined. They are simply surviving, moving their arms and legs in desperate, repeated patterns, hoping to stay on their feet, hoping their weapon meets flesh before another finds theirs. And when a man is finally struck, whether by sword, club, or boot, he rarely understands what has happened before falling, and if he does, he has no strength left to scream. This is not the noble moment painted in scrolls and song. This is not the heroic push that wins the day. This is the moment when war becomes work, hard, thankless, filthy work, done with broken fingers and shattered nerves by men who no longer care who wins, only who falls last. There is a moment in every battle, not marked by horns or commands, but by the sound of a man gasping for air under someone else's weight, or the sickening crunch of a skull crushed by a hammer swung too low. When all sense of order vanishes, when formations break not from cowardice but from physics, and what began as a clash between armies devolves into a writhing knot of individuals locked in survival, blind to rank, to command, to purpose, seeing only what is in front of them and feeling only what is under their feet, mud, blood, bone, and the soft collapse of something once alive. This is the phase of the battle that no bard ever dared describe, where no chronicle speaks in numbers or glories, because numbers dissolve here, not into dust, but into confusion, into grunts and sobs, and the cold, unrelenting drag of fatigue that turns even the strongest arms into trembling limbs, barely able to lift a shield, let alone swing with precision. Weapons are lost, flung from hands, dropped in panic, snapped in half against helms, and men fight with fists, elbows, knives pulled from belts, even teeth, biting through leather and flesh because the hand they once trusted now refuses to close properly, or the sword has vanished somewhere beneath the trampling feet of those still moving forward. Mud becomes an enemy all its own, not just wet earth, but a deep, clinging force that sucks at boots, steals footing, and hides the bodies that already lie beneath it. One step too far in the wrong direction and a soldier sinks knee-deep, flailing to recover balance as a blade swings toward his unguarded side. Another stumbles backward into a corpse face down in a puddle, and before he can scream, another falls onto him, driving the breath from his lungs, crushing him into silence beneath the weight of panic and plate. Helmets fill with steam from the breath of men who haven't rested for hours. Eyes sting from salt and smoke. Throats burn not from shouting, but from dust, ash, and the iron tang of air made thick by suffering. Blunt force dominates here, not because it is more elegant or efficient, but because it is more certain. A sword can be deflected, dulled, stuck. But a hammer, a mace, a flanged club, these do not care about mail or padding or shields. They crush, they break. They turn ribs into splinters and helmets into coffins. A man struck by a sword might scream. A man struck by a warhammer often doesn't, because his lungs no longer hold shape, or because the force has knocked him insensible before he realizes he is dying. The noise of this world is no longer musical. It is rhythmic, primal, repetitive. The slap of wet flesh, the dull thunk of metal against bone, the gurgle of blood in a crushed windpipe. There is no longer any front or rear. You fight beside whoever stands closest, or you fight alone, or you crawl beneath shields trying to find a breath of air that doesn't taste like someone else's death. Bodies pile in uneven layers, some twitching, some already cold, and with each step, a soldier feels not just the resistance of mud, but the slippery give of a corpse beneath his foot, the sudden sagging of a leg that has ceased to resist weight. The ground becomes not a place to stand, but a trap, alive, treacherous, eager to swallow anything that cannot move quickly enough to avoid its pull. Occasionally, someone will try to retreat, not because they are cowards, but because the mind begins to crack under the weight of it all, and a voice buried somewhere in memory screams that this cannot be how it ends. Not here, not suffocating beneath strangers, not faceless and forgotten. But turning is not escape. It is death from behind, a blade between the ribs, a spear to the kidney, or a club swung so hard the skull bursts like fruit. In battle, the only way out is forward, and even that direction leads nowhere. Those who still live in this moment do not feel like warriors. They feel like animals, cornered, soaked and shaking, their minds reduced to single words: hit, breathe, step. Again. There is no thought of valor, no pride in courage. There is only the dull, nauseating certainty that nothing outside this pit of motion and pain exists anymore, that time has stopped ticking forward, and that no god, no king, and no mother's prayer will pull them out if their arms fail before their enemies do. This is not the part of battle people write poems about. This is the part they erase. Not because it's less important, but because it's too close to truth. It is not about victory or defeat. It is about not being the next one to fall into the mud, wide-eyed and wordless, beneath the boots of men who stopped believing there would be an end. Once the pressure of clashing lines dissolves and the ranks lose cohesion under the weight of exhaustion and confusion, the battlefield shifts from a contest between armies to a landscape of isolated chaos, where orders scatter like dust and the sound of leadership is drowned in a rising storm of human desperation. No commander, however skilled or feared, can restore order once the structure is gone. Once formations have bled into one another and each man begins to act not as a part of a strategy, but as a creature trying only to live through the next few seconds. Voices raised in command are lost amid the screams, not the heroic shouts of literature, but jagged, panicked howls of wounded men, of soldiers calling out to comrades who cannot hear or respond, of captains yelling to hold ground while the earth beneath them becomes a mire of shifting feet, shattered gear, and the stench of blood. Even when the signal horns blow or the banners rise, the men beneath them do not see or understand. Their eyes are blurred with sweat, their ears numb from the clamor, and their minds overwhelmed by the raw noise of too many people fighting and falling in too small a space. There are still those who try to obey, to follow the structure once drilled into them in training. But those efforts collapse when companions disappear in the smoke or fall to blades that seem to come from nowhere. In the haze of fear and fatigue, even recognition breaks down, and helmets or surcoats that once marked friend from foe blur into anonymous shapes. Each one a threat, each one a motion that might mean death if not struck first. Men who hesitate to identify are cut down. Men who guess wrongly kill their own. The battlefield begins to fracture into clusters of motion, not units, not companies, but accidental knots of bodies, formed by whoever remains on their feet, swinging at whatever moves, clutching broken shields and sticky hilts with blistered hands, locked not in coordinated assault but in animal instinct. Some groups try to press forward, driven by duty or momentum, while others retreat in disordered lines, dragging the wounded or abandoning them. Not out of cruelty, but because they have lost the luxury of choice. Confusion breeds faster than fear, spreading between ranks like smoke, and within moments, isolated incidents become chain reactions. One man sees movement in the rear and believes the flank has collapsed. Another mistakes a retreating group for an ambush, and soon entire pockets of soldiers turn their backs to the enemy, not because they are cowards, but because they are human, and their minds can no longer process what is real and what is imagined. Morale breaks not with a roar, but with a ripple, silent at first, but soon unstoppable. In this chaos, terrain becomes the enemy. What once offered advantage now betrays. Slopes collapse under wet boots. Shallow streams become grave traps slick with blood, and uneven ground turns every step into a gamble. Some fall and vanish beneath the mass of motion. Others fight to rise and are struck before their knees straighten. Hills, once used by archers, are now blind spots. Forests that gave cover now conceal enemies or disappear the wounded forever. Every inch of ground feels unstable, and no direction feels safe. Voices that once calmed now sound like madness. Commanders who survive long enough to shout are often ignored, not out of rebellion, but because their words no longer fit this world of senseless movement and shattered lines. Some are cut down by the very soldiers they try to rally, not from betrayal, but because no one can tell who they are anymore, and a figure on horseback with a raised sword looks no different than a charging enemy when seen through smoke, blood, and exhaustion. Those who still fight do so with no thought of outcome. Their arms rise and fall without aim. Their legs move because stopping is worse. Their minds echo only with the command to keep going, to not fall, to not freeze, to keep striking until something, anything, changes. There is no heroism here. No one sees what others do. No one will remember who stood firm and who wavered. All will be remembered, if remembered at all, as part of the noise, as one more body in a storm that had no center, no plan, and no mercy. This is the moment when war loses its name, when the battle is no longer between lords or banners, but between silence and screams, between direction and instinct, and when every man, no matter how trained or brave, fights not for victory, but to stay alive in a place that no longer makes sense. There is no clear signal when an army begins to break, no trumpet to declare retreat, no banner that waves in defeat, because collapse in battle never happens cleanly or all at once. It begins with a glance over the shoulder, a widening of the eyes, a foot that shifts backward instead of forward. And suddenly, without any plan, the air changes, not in sound, but in weight, as the shared illusion of resistance crumbles in the minds of tired, terrified men who begin to understand, each at his own pace, that they are losing, and that staying means dying. At first, it is just a few soldiers stepping back, then turning to run, slowly at first, awkwardly, as if unsure they're permitted to flee. But within moments, that hesitation becomes momentum, and momentum becomes panic, and panic becomes a stampede, not of horses, but of men still clutching weapons they no longer believe they'll use, trampling the wounded, dropping their shields, slipping in blood and mud, throwing off helmets for breath they cannot catch, and screaming not at the enemy, but at each other, because no one wants to be the last to run. Commanders shout to hold the line, but their voices vanish like smoke against the rising roar of flight. A sound unlike anything else on the battlefield, filled not with rage or courage, but with naked, uncontrolled fear. The kind that shoves a man forward even as his muscles scream, even as his mind begs for direction, because he is no longer thinking, no longer part of an army or a cause, only a moving body trying to outpace the shadow of death he can feel crawling up his back. And then the slaughter begins, not during the battle, but after the enemy turns, because pursuit is not merely encouraged, it is expected, and those who break first rarely survive, not because they fought poorly, but because running strips away every advantage. Shields are gone, backs are exposed, and pursuers, still half blind with adrenaline and bloodlust, see only easy kills ahead of them. Cavalry are unleashed at this moment not as a strategy, but as a sentence, and mounted men, fresh compared to the broken foot soldiers they now chase, ride down fleeing figures with brutal efficiency, swords slashing, hooves crushing, lances driving through backs never meant to bear armor. There is no room for mercy. Mercy means delay. Mercy means danger. To spare a fleeing man is to risk him turning with a blade, or finding his footing and rallying others, and so the killing continues with ruthless focus. Soldiers do not aim to wound. They aim to end, with a single blow, a downward strike, a boot to the head of someone already half buried. Some do not even look at the faces of those they kill. They strike shapes, motions, fleeing shadows. And many will claim later that they remember none of it. The ground itself becomes a trap. Men slip in streams slick with blood and algae. They fall into ditches hidden by grass. Some run into their own lines, only to be struck by friendly spears or beaten by comrades who believe they are deserters or traitors. Others are crushed beneath carts, horses, or their fellow fugitives, unable to rise, arms flailing until the noise of pursuit passes over them like a storm. There is no dignity here, only the raw mechanics of death, stripped of ceremony, stripped of names, happening in fields where wildflowers will grow next season, oblivious to what soaked the soil beneath them. In the chaos, some men fake death, collapsing among corpses and lying still, eyes open, breath shallow, praying they are not noticed, not stepped on, not stabbed as an afterthought. A few succeed, most do not. Pursuers strike at every body that moves, every twitch, every groan. There are no prisoners in this moment. There are only survivors and those too slow, too weak, or too wounded to escape. This is the true face of collapse, not a noble surrender or a waving of white cloth, but a descent into terror and slaughter so complete that even the victors feel it change them, though they will not admit it. Not while the sun still burns the backs of the fallen, not while their hands are still wet with blood they cannot wash off in rivers that run red through the grass. For the dead it ends. For the living, something begins, something they will carry with them into every dream, every silence, and every winter that follows. When the killing finally stops, it doesn't stop all at once, nor does it bring the relief many had imagined during the worst of it, because battles do not end with a sound or a signal, but with a gradual unraveling, a thinning of noise, a slowing of motion, a moment when the swinging arms grow heavy, when footsteps no longer crash against the earth and the shouts of the living begin to fade, not into victory songs, but into something colder, heavier, more unbearable than anything that came before. The battlefield, moments ago a blur of rage and terror, stands still in a silence that does not soothe but stings, not because it is peaceful, but because it reveals everything that has been broken, scattered, and left behind. The smoke still hangs low, clinging to the churned mud like a second skin, and within it lie the bodies. Too many to count, too twisted to identify, arranged in unnatural poses that speak of sudden impact and violent death. Some are whole, but eerily still, their eyes wide open to skies they'll never see again, while others are not whole at all, missing limbs, split open at the waist, burned to the bone, or so crushed beneath horses and men that it's impossible to tell where one figure ends and another begins. The living walk among them slowly, not with purpose, but with the hollow movements of those still in shock, their limbs dragging, their minds unable to reconcile the fact that it is over, that the sound has stopped, but their hands still tremble and their mouths still taste iron. There are cries, though not many. The wounded groan, call for help, or whisper names into the dirt, but no one answers quickly. Those strong enough to move are too numb to act, and those tasked with tending to the fallen arrive late, if they arrive at all. Some crawl toward anything that moves, thinking it a healer or a brother, only to find another dying man, too far gone to speak. Others lie still, eyes half closed, not unconscious, but unwilling to rejoin a world that allowed this to happen. The line between the living and the dead becomes a blur, a flicker of movement, a sound in the throat, the twitch of a finger in the mud. And many are left behind simply because no one can tell for sure whether they've already crossed over. Victory, if it belongs to anyone, is not celebrated. The victors don't cheer. They don't lift their swords in triumph. They walk in silence, stepping over corpses, kicking aside shields, too drained to feel pride, because what they've seen has carved something out of them that won't grow back. Some lean on their weapons like canes, too tired to stand straight. Others sit in the mud beside the bodies of comrades, not speaking, not weeping, just staring at the faces of men they had spoken with hours earlier. Faces now slack, empty, mouths open as if still trying to ask why. And yet, even here, even now, not all motion has stopped. There are scavengers, men with knives and empty pouches, wandering the field for whatever remains of value, a ring, a boot, a purse that didn't sink into the mire. They move quickly, sometimes with shame, sometimes with practiced ease, stripping the dead and dying alike, sometimes whispering apologies, sometimes humming as they work. Horses limp through the wreckage, wounded and wild-eyed, their riders gone. Birds begin to circle, sensing what nature always does. The sun, indifferent to everything below, continues to rise or fall, casting golden light over broken armor and stained banners that flutter weakly in the breeze. Among the ruins, there are moments of recognition. A soldier finding his brother, a captain recognizing the corpse of a squire who had carried his water. And when that happens, there is no wail, no theatrical grief, only silence, or a whispered name, or the slow lowering of a body into the mud with a hand placed gently over the eyes. There are no graves yet, only piles or rows or circles of men left where they fell. Some are too damaged to move. Others will be buried without names. A few will be burned depending on the weather, the Lord's orders, or the presence of disease. Nothing smells like a battlefield after the fight. Not just the blood and sweat, but the rot already beginning, the sour scent of ruptured organs, The scorched hair and smoldering wood, the excrement loosed in death, the damp mold of trampled earth soaked with what can never be washed away. The men who walk here will carry that scent for days, for weeks, for the rest of their lives, soaked into skin, into clothing, into memory. It will follow them through cities and winter nights, rise up in dreams, return in silence. When the field finally emptied, when the dead were buried or burned, when the wounded were carried off or left behind to vanish beneath the coming rain, the story of the battle did not remain in the hands of those who fought it, because the people who would later write about it were not the men who stood in the mud, swung weapons, or watched their friends die gasping for air with a broken blade still in their chest. It was not the peasant archer who would be asked to explain how the lines broke or who struck the final blow, nor the foot soldier who spent an hour trying to pull himself from beneath two corpses with a dislocated shoulder and a spear through his thigh. History did not begin there. It began days or weeks later, at a table far from the blood, with ink instead of mud, with parchment instead of steel, with a quill held by a man whose hands had never blistered inside a gauntlet or slipped on blood-soaked leather. These writers, often monks or clerks in service of lords and kings, worked not to preserve truth, but to shape it, because the point of a chronicle was not to record pain, but to construct meaning, and that meaning had to serve someone. If the battle was won, it was called glorious. If it was lost, it was called tragic. But either way, it was transformed, reshaped into a pattern, a symbol, a lesson, something that fit within a story people could be proud of or afraid of or inspired by. The dead became numbers. The screams became silence. The mud was erased with a single stroke. And above it all, the names that survived belonged not to the hundreds who swung and fell, but to the handful who gave the order to begin. It was easier that way. Easier to say that one side stood bravely and the other fled in shame. Easier to describe the battle as a moment of divine judgment, or righteous cause, or the turning point in a long and noble war, rather than the slow grinding down of human bodies into something unrecognizable. Songs were written, paintings were commissioned, tapestries were woven that showed knights shining on horseback, banners caught in the wind, swords raised high as enemies fell around them. These were not lies, exactly. They were simplifications, reductions, things easier to remember than the smell of rot, the sound of gurgling breath, or the way a man screamed when his stomach opened and he tried to hold his insides with trembling hands. Those who survived the battle carried their truth with them, but most had no voice, not in courts, not in books, not in the pages of history. The peasant who returned home with a ruined leg was not asked to testify. The squire who watched his lord fall and never found his body was not invited to the scriptorium. The archer whose arrow killed a man he never saw was not honored in verse. Their stories lived only in memory, and even that memory twisted with time, softened in some places, sharpened in others, until it became something closer to silence than speech. And for many, silence was easier than trying to explain what it felt like to push a blade into a man's throat and feel the warmth of his blood on your wrist. Easier than describing how you tripped over a friend's body and couldn't stop shaking for hours. Easier than admitting that during the flight, during the slaughter, during the blind panic when the line collapsed, you stepped on someone's chest and heard it break, and never turned back to see who it was. Those who wanted to remember cleanly turned to myths. They told stories of singular acts of courage, of one knight holding a bridge, of one charge breaking the enemy's will, of a banner lifted in the darkest moment that rallied the troops to victory. And perhaps those things happened, but even if they did, they were not the whole story. They were moments, small flashes in a day that lasted hours and cost thousands of lives. They were easy to retell, easy to celebrate. The rest, the crawling, the bleeding, the fear, the pleading, the madness, was not. What remained were names carved into stone, dates etched into chronicles, and simplified versions of events passed down through generations that never felt the mud under their feet, never heard a dying man whisper for his mother. never saw how the ground still steamed the morning after. And so the truth was not exactly forgotten. It was ignored, rewritten, replaced, not because it wasn't real, but because it was too much to carry. When people speak of battles years later, when the noise has faded, when the wounds have scarred or rotted, when the names of the fallen have been lost even to those who once whispered them, they almost always reach for one word first: glory. They use it like a shield, like a final offering meant to cover what truly happened, because to call it what it was, brutal, senseless, exhausting, would be to admit something far more difficult, something that cannot be carved into stone or sung in a hall or stitched into a banner. Glory never smelled the battlefield. It never slipped in blood or touched the skin of a dying man. It never felt the weight of a friend's body slumped across its back. Never heard the wet gasp of someone trying to breathe through a shattered jaw. Never looked down at its own hands and wondered whose blood stained them and why it wasn't enough to stop the shaking. Glory came later, like a guest arriving after the meal has gone cold, admiring what remains and calling it beautiful. The truth is simpler and far heavier. Men fought because they were told to, or because they were paid to, or because they had no land, no trade, and no choice. Some fought for causes they believed in. But belief does not stop a blade, nor does it make the dying quicker or cleaner. It did not matter whether a man was brave or afraid. Both were crushed just the same beneath the weight of steel, the thud of hooves, the roll of fear that swept across the field like fog and did not lift until the last cry fell silent. Many of those who died were never even named in the records. Their bones became part of the land. Their faces faded. Their families received nothing but rumors, if they received anything at all. No statue bears their likeness. No monk copied their story. They were sons, fathers, husbands, apprentices, and now they are dust. Those who survived did not walk home with pride in their step or songs in their mouths. They walked slowly, often with a limp, carrying wounds they could not show and memories they could not escape. Some could not speak of it. Some could not stop speaking of it. Most were never asked. And yet the same words were spoken each time: brave, noble, just. The same phrases were written in chronicles, inscribed in stone, whispered in churches. They were meant to make sense of something senseless, to impose structure where there was only collapse, to give weight to sacrifice by pretending it was always meant to be. But the ones who bled knew better. They knew that battles were not triumphs. They were ruptures. Something broke each time, not just in the ground or the flesh, but in the soul. Even the victors could not escape that truth. They stood on the field after the last arrow had flown, looked at what they had won, and found only silence. There was no joy in that silence, only the awareness that whatever had been proven today, it had come at a cost that could not be measured in land or silver or titles. They might be called heroes in the weeks to come, but in that moment, they were simply alive, and even that did not feel like a reward. The banners that once fluttered now lay torn in the mud. The songs that would be written later had not yet begun. The wounds still bled. The sky did not care. The birds returned. The earth began, slowly, to reclaim what had been spilled upon it, and history moved on, eager to forget the small truths that made up the larger lie. Because what truly happened in a medieval battle was not carved into stone or stitched into flags. It was not preserved in ink or praised by poets. It was hidden in the hollowed eyes of survivors, in the dirt under broken nails, in the silence that followed when no one had the strength left to scream. And that is why glory is a lie, not because there is nothing worth remembering, but because what is remembered is almost never what was real. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.